What I'll be speaking from today is just a manuscript that I've recently put together called Entrepreneurship and Economic Growth. And I start out considering the question of what causes economic growth. At the risk of oversimplification, the answers that economists have given to this question can be divided into two broad camps. One following the ideas of Adam Smith, and the other following the ideas of David Ricardo. Smith's overriding goal was to try to understand the wealth creation process, and the title of his treatise, The Wealth of Nations, illustrates that. And the first lesson that we get in The Wealth of Nations is that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. As Adam Smith saw it, as markets grew, entrepreneurship would lead to innovation that would lead to an increasing division of labor and increased productivity. Ricardo, in contrast, viewed output as being a function of inputs. He viewed that the income of a nation was produced by the inputs of land, labor, and capital. He took a production function approach to the question of economic growth. Investment could produce more capital, which in turn could increase economic growth. But because of diminishing marginal factor productivity and the existence of fixed factors, in particular land, population growth would always dominate economic growth, and most of the population would remain at a subsistence level of income. The ideas of Ricardo and his friend and contemporary Malthus pushed this idea on economics and ended up giving economics the name the dismal science. It sounds none too good the way Ricardo was describing it. But this contrasts sharply with Adam Smith's view of entrepreneurship and innovation that would lead to ever-increasing economic growth through an increased division of labor. Through hindsight, we can see that Smith's vision of economic growth was more accurate than Ricardo's. But as it happens, the economics profession has followed Ricardo's views more closely than Smith's. I think a big part of that, especially if we look at 20th century growth theory, has been the comparative statics nature of economic models. Because of the comparative statics nature of economic modeling, it's a lot easier to take the production function view of economic output and economic growth, and it's a lot harder to model things within that framework, to model innovation, the increased division of labor, and so forth. So as economics has become more and more scientific over the 20th century, we've increasingly tried to model the economic problems that we've been looking at within this more mathematical, more scientific approach. And that's led us to focus more on the aspects of the economy that we're better able to parameterize, that we can better fit into general equilibrium models. And it's been a little bit more difficult to take that approach looking at the division of labor, entrepreneurship, and innovation and so forth, because it doesn't really fit into that production function approach and that general equilibrium approach so well. You've probably heard the joke. In fact, Roger tells me everybody's heard the joke about the guy who's in the night, he's looking around on the sidewalk here. Somebody comes along, can I help you? What's going on? He says, yeah. He says, I've lost my ring. And he said, where'd you lose it? And the guy says, well, over there across the street. He says, well, why are you looking here? He said, well, the light's better over here. And in a sense, that's the way that economic modeling of economic growth has taken place, that we've got models that are amenable to looking at problems in particular ways, and so we're looking at for the answers to those problems where the light is better rather than where it's actually more likely that we'll end up finding the answer. If we take that production function approach along Ricardian lines, with output being a function of land, labor, and capital, it really seems like the way to get economic growth is through investment. And so a lot of the advice that economists have given over the last half century as to how to get economies to grow has been to invest. However, the Smithian approach to economic growth focuses more on innovation than investment. And in considering these problems, it occurred to me that Israel Kirzner's ideas of entrepreneurship fit in well with the Smithian idea of economic growth and the wealth of nations, and that it might be possible to incorporate Kirzner's vision of entrepreneurship into more standard views of economic growth and perhaps get some better answers. In Kirzner's view, entrepreneurs act by seizing on previously unnoticed profit opportunities. But these profit opportunities have to come from somewhere, and as I'll discuss in more detail later on, I think the most common source of profit opportunities is the prior activities of other entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship itself creates profit opportunities, which then opens up the opportunity for further entrepreneurship. One distinction that I want to make, this was a distinction I made a little bit earlier in some comments, is the distinction between looking at the process of economic growth versus the environment that produces economic growth, or the environment within which economic growth can occur. And I think there's good reason for considering both, but what I intend to look at more today is the process of economic growth rather than the environment within which economic growth occurs. In fact, I guess if we divide up an examination of economic growth that way, we've got a pretty good balance here on the panel, because I think the Betke and Olson papers more were involved with the environment in which economic growth can occur, whereas Garrison's paper and my paper deal more with the process by which economic growth is produced. I think it's worthwhile to look at the environment, and in fact there's been a lot of interest lately at looking at the environment. Jerry Scully has a couple of things. He had an article in the JPE a few years ago and has recently come out with a book essentially advocating market institutions and suggesting that economic freedom leads to additional economic growth. Barrow has done a little bit of work along those lines, of course, your work. And I'll also advertise again the book that Pete Betke mentioned by my colleague Jim Gortney, along with Bob Lawson and Walter Block. This year put out a book on measuring economic freedom. And they have they've gone through a lot of care to draw up indexes of economic freedom and shown how a higher index of economic freedom leads to more economic growth. And I might say one of the things that they did that I think has not been done in this literature so much in the past is they've got a pretty comprehensive index of economic freedom. They look at a lot of the components of economic freedom: stable monetary policy, freedom of exchange, protection of property rights. Another interesting variable that they include in economic freedom that might be worth some discussion later on is the size of government. They find that smaller governments lead, they call that more economic freedom and show that that's correlated with economic growth. And the interesting thing about their work is that they really focus on economic variables. There's been a lot of empirical work. The Barrow's work that I've seen has drawn on this index that's been put out by Gastiel. Scully's work uses that same index, and that index has a lot of political type freedoms, how democratic a country is, you know, if you have the right to vote and so forth. Excuse me. And Gortney and his colleagues explicitly leave out any of those political variables to look specifically just at economic freedom. So while I see some good reason for looking at the institutional characteristics that lead to economic growth, nevertheless, most of what I'm going to focus on is going to be with the process of economic growth. Contemporary growth theory perhaps starts with the Solow model, or at least most economists who are familiar with growth theory will be able to trace it back at least to the Solow model, where, again, using that Ricardian production function approach, we find that growth is a function, or output is a function of capital and labor and in some way time. So we've got some Solow residual. Presumably the time itself doesn't cause economic growth, but there's something that's correlated with time that leads to higher levels of output over time. And there's been a lot of interesting results out of this literature. The idea of some golden rule of growth was popular at one time. The idea of convergence, where growth rates across countries ought to converge, is an interesting idea, and in fact has led to further developments in growth theory, because as a matter of fact, when we look at growth rates across countries, we find out that they don't converge, that some countries seem to have persistently low growth rates, other countries seem to have persistently higher growth rates, and so that's opened up the question of looking at why it is that convergence doesn't occur. When we consider something like the Solow model, and we look at the relationships among output, capital, and labor, it's relatively easy to model those things, and despite some measurement difficulties, it's relatively easy to measure capital and labor and output so we can estimate production functions and so forth. And the effect of time in the Solow model is a little bit more problematic. It's been associated with technological change. We think that in some way or another probably technology advances over time. And so that's how time ends up having its impact. But nevertheless, that's pretty nebulous, and it's hard to measure. And it's easier to measure capital and labor, so as a result, I guess that's where the light is better. We focused in on capital and labor as a result. And, you know, lest we think that we've just done that for simplicity because these things are easier to measure, or that we're using it as some sort of a framework for economic growth or something like that, these Ricardian-type growth models have been taken pretty seriously by economists and policymakers, and they've been considered to be pretty policy relevant, so that in the decades after World War II, when economists have offered policy advice as to what we can do to get less developed economies to grow, looking at something along the lines of the Solow model, we've advised them to invest. And, you know, if we can get more capital in the economy, increase the capital-labor ratio, that would help. Other economies around the world have developed economies have developed through industrialization, so that seemed like a good plan. We have advised less developed economies to industrialize, invest in industries, and try to bring them along to become competitive on the world market. But the advice turned out not to be very good advice, and despite the fact that following the investment advice of the World Bank and a bunch of consulting economists and so forth, that investment was the key, a lot of money has gone into less developed economies, and in many cases they've remained underdeveloped, even though it would appear that investment would be the key in the Solow model. And so that leads to looking in other areas to try to figure out, well, okay, maybe if investment isn't the key, maybe there's other things that we might be able to do. And again, looking at the nebulous effect of time, if we think that technology might have been the answer, that technology is what advances over time, then maybe what we can do is increase the level of technology available. Maybe increased research and development might make economies more productive over time. Or again, looking within the Ricardian framework, if in part you would expect R&D in developed countries to spill over to less developed countries, maybe that's not the answer either. Economists have recently noticed that somewhat neglected variable there, if we think that output is a function of capital and labor and somehow output advances over time. Wow, we forgot to notice labor. So maybe labor really is the key and not capital. But it hasn't been so much labor, like the number of bodies itself, that economists have focused on recently, but rather human capital. And it may turn out that it's human capital that leads to economic growth. Lucas has been one of the pioneers here in his paper in 1988 talking about the forces that lead to economic growth. Was one of the early mainstream economists to suggest that maybe labor is the key, and specifically human capital, and so if we invest in human capital and education, that's a good thing to do. And I have to say, I really like that argument myself, because working in a state university, I'm thinking, yeah, if we invest more in education, that's probably going to spill over into the well-being of college faculty and so forth. I don't know if it'll really help growth or not, but I'll push the argument just for my own self-interest. In contrast to this Ricardian view, the Smithian view of economic growth has focused less on the quantities of factors of production going into the production process and more on the process itself. I mean, even from the beginning of Smith's Wealth of Nations, when he has that nice example of the pin factory and he talks about how much more productive people are due to the division of labor. What he's really thinking of is not inputs into the production process. I mean, you've got the same raw materials, the same people making pins. So Smith isn't talking about inputs into a production process. He's talking about the process itself and how we might be able to alter and develop the production process in order to make us more productive with the same inputs. And this idea has been noticed occasionally throughout the 20th century. There's a nice paper by Alan Young in 1928 on increasing returns in economic progress. And Young explicitly builds his ideas on Adam Smith and develops the idea that there may be increasing returns, and it's increasing returns that leads to economic growth and economic progress. That's a very Smithian way of looking at the idea of economic growth. However, increasing returns doesn't really work that well all the time in a general equilibrium model. So at the same time, if you've got these general equilibrium models of growth, you're trying to build on the Solow model, which essentially is an equilibrium model, increasing returns might not fit in so well. And there was an article I remember reading in graduate school, which I was fascinated about at the time, by Nicholas Calder in 1972, called The Irrelevance of Equilibrium Economics. And Calder's article built upon Alan Young's article, which in turn goes back to Adam Smith. But Calder was arguing that, in fact, increasing returns really is the answer to economic growth, but that doesn't really fit in too well with the general equilibrium framework that most economists are using. So Calder's answer to this was just to throw out general equilibrium analysis altogether. Actually, some of these general equilibrium economists have gotten a little bit better at building in some of these ideas of increasing returns. And it may well be, it's problematic if you have increasing returns in particular industries, because then you end up getting all kinds of corner solutions and indeterminacies and that sort of thing. And excuse me, we really like determinate interior solutions to our models, right? So about 2 weeks ago, I got a little ill, and I still have this residual cough. So if I break into a hacking cough in the middle of my talk, it's but lately, economists looking at the idea of economic growth have gotten more into the idea of increasing returns, and especially it can be modeled pretty well if instead of having particular industries having increasing returns, if the increasing returns are economy-wide, even though there are decreasing returns in particular industries, and that occurs by having spillovers. So you might have some kind of technology spillovers or information spillovers or knowledge spillovers, and Paul Romer has put together a few models that show how this can work. So in each individual sector you have decreasing returns to scale, and yet because of these spillovers across sectors of the economy, you end up having increasing returns. Romer also focuses on the role of human capital. So human capital has become, has really replaced physical capital as I think the darling of mainstream growth theory these days anyway. Romer shows how additional research and development activity can promote more economic growth because there might be increasing returns to R&D. And it also could be that that these returns might be localized, so there might be more localized spillovers, so you can have geographic concentrations of areas where because of spillovers there ends up being higher growth rates, other areas have lower growth rates. So we can sort of massage the Ricardian approach to economic growth in order to fit some of the facts like non-convergence. And so contemporary models, even though these models I think fit into what I would consider the Ricardian growth framework, nevertheless fit the empirical facts a little bit better. If we look at the facts of economic growth, I think they have to weigh against the idea of inputs into the production process causing economic growth. Of course, this occurred to Ricardo right away because of the problem of decreasing returns. But over the history of the world, there have been lots of economies that seem to have had the inputs in place that would have led to economic growth, and yet where economic growth hasn't occurred. I think earlier we had mentioned the idea of China that had a lot of physical capital, a lot of human capital, they were technologically advanced, and yet the economy didn't take off and didn't grow. The pyramids in Egypt still remain as a monument to the physical capital that they have there, but I'm not sure it was really directed into the sectors that might have caused the most economic growth. Knowledge has been developing over the centuries. You've got to be inspired by guys like Leonardo da Vinci, yet for all of his genius and the knowledge that he had, it really didn't lead to economic growth, which is a relatively recent phenomenon. In fact, if you extrapolate backwards, today real GNP is about 37 times as large as it was in 1874. It's about 7 times larger than in 1919. It's more than 3 times larger than in 1950. If we extrapolate backwards, extrapolate this growth backwards, we can see we don't have to go back very far, a couple of centuries perhaps, before we get to a point where we would be at the subsistence level. The economic growth that we have today could not have occurred over a very long period of time. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. Despite the fact that the inputs to the production process, in a lot of cases, were in place. Again, China seems like a good example. So it's probably not the inputs into the production process, but rather changes in the process itself. It's the Smithian view of growth rather than the Ricardian view of growth that really explains why we have economic growth. And the Austrians seem to fit well into that Smithian tradition. Bomba depicted a structure of production that was picked up by Hayek and later by Garrison. And incorporated into economic models, where we look at the structure of production, we look at more roundabout production processes. What we're really focusing in on there is the process by which economic output is produced, as opposed to the inputs into the production process per se. This idea remains current in the Austrian theory. In fact, I think that Roger's presentation this morning is a good example about how we can get some pretty interesting results by looking at the process of production as opposed to focusing on the inputs into the production process. If we consider the role of entrepreneurship and technological change, in the neoclassical framework, even if we consider more recent growth models like those of Lucas and those of Romer, where there is some focus on the process and technological change and research and development are important, still it seems to me that those models go back to the Ricardian framework. In other words, if we think that technological advance is good and we can produce technology through R&D, then what we do is we combine resources into the production process and we produce research and development in those models the same way we produce other output. So we're really not focusing on the process of production at all, but rather we're looking at inputs into the production process, but instead of focusing so much on physical capital like we did in the 1950s and 60s, now we're focusing on human capital or knowledge or research and development or something like that. So what's the alternative? Well, one alternative is Kirzner's model of entrepreneurship. Kirzner views that entrepreneurs are people who are alert enough to spot previously unseen profit opportunities and then act on them. So in Kirzner's view, the activity of entrepreneurship is noticing something that nobody's noticed before. And I think Kirzner's ideas build on Hayek's ideas, and especially in his 1945 article, The Use of Knowledge in Society, where everybody has some specific knowledge of time and place, knowledge that's specific to their activities and what they're doing that other people don't have. And if given the proper incentives, people then can act on the specific information of time and place that they have in order to be entrepreneurial. How does it happen that people can spot entrepreneurial opportunities that nobody's seen before? Economic theory really biases us against thinking that this is possible because in the neoclassical competitive equilibrium, all of the profit opportunities have been competed away. In fact, if we think about that joke, Roger told me not to tell any jokes, but if we think about the joke that forms the title of your paper, Manser, about finding the big bills on the sidewalk. Does everybody know that joke? Yeah. If we think about that joke, you know, I mean, the reason why it's funny to economists, and I've found in telling the joke, it's not funny to anybody but economists, but the reason why it's funny to economists is it shows you, in a sense, how ridiculous the equilibrium theory that we advocate is. But where do these profit opportunities come from? I don't think that Kirzner really gives a very good answer to this question. Actually, he's not that interested in answering the question. In his book, Competition and Entrepreneurship, he really focuses on entrepreneurship as an equilibrating mechanism and shows how the activities of entrepreneurs can help bring an economy into equilibrium. So he's not so much interested in where the profit opportunities come from or how they get noticed, but the fact that entrepreneurial activity is an equilibrating function. Well, let me give you my answer to that question. I think that most profit opportunities get noticed by entrepreneurs because they're new. They spring up, they're new, something that wasn't there before. People tend to notice it, and entrepreneurs tend to act on those profit opportunities, and that's what initiates the Kirznerian entrepreneurial process. Perhaps you have to have some special insight to really see what those profit opportunities are. In hindsight, they're perhaps easier to see than in foresight, but nevertheless, if we consider famous entrepreneurs and see the way that they've acted, Andrew Carnegie, who built his fortune in U.S. Steel, was quick to notice that the Bessemer process was a more productive way of producing steel and capitalized on that new process. It's not like it was sitting around for centuries and all of a sudden Carnegie notices it. It's a newly developed process that Carnegie is able to capitalize on. Henry Ford, who was entrepreneurial in developing the assembly line and producing automobiles through assembly lines, could only do that when there was a mass market for automobiles. In order for there to be a mass market for automobiles, there had to be the service stations, the roads. In other words, there had to be other automobiles around. So it wouldn't really have been feasible to have assembly line production of automobiles before the environment was the way it was in Ford's time. So Henry Ford, sensing a profit opportunity and acting on it, this wasn't something that had gone unnoticed for centuries. Things had changed. The environment had changed. The profit opportunity was a relatively recent opportunity. Bill Gates, who became a multi-billionaire producing microcomputer software, was able to do that because microcomputers suddenly became possible. It's not like microcomputers were sitting around for centuries with no decent operating system, and all of a sudden it occurs to Gates. I mean, he was one of the first people there on the scene to see that profit opportunity. So it's not like it's not like these $20 bills are lying around on the sidewalk for us to notice, but as soon as they're dropped, people pick them up pretty quickly. The profit opportunities are noticed because they're new. There's something that wasn't there before, that people hadn't seen before because they weren't there before. Another good example is Ray Kroc and McDonald's. Who had the good idea of, hey, we can make the food before the customers show up, and then we can give it to them really quickly. The original McDonald's sold almost entirely to drive-in customers, but there was a particular kind of market that had to exist at that time. When America became more mobile, more people are traveling by automobile, they can stop in and pick up their hamburgers and so forth. The opportunity is ripe. And in fact, it wasn't even Ray Kroc that started McDonald's. McDonald's was a going concern at the time. And Ray Kroc was a guy who was selling like blenders, milkshake makers, and this McDonald's restaurant ordered a whole bunch of these things. And Ray Kroc is curious. He just, he's going to fill this order, but he thought, I'm going to go out and look at this restaurant because I want to see what kind of a restaurant is ordering so many of these things. And so he looked at the restaurant and actually saw an opportunity that perhaps the McDonald's who started the restaurant didn't see. He just bought up the chain and was very entrepreneurial about it. But that's an opportunity that was a relatively recent opportunity. It's not that opportunity wasn't sitting around for centuries or even decades. The market environment had changed, and really as soon as that opportunity was available for the picking, Ray Kroc took advantage of it. A lot of these entrepreneurial activities excuse me. Entrepreneurial activities arise because of the activities of other entrepreneurs. We see that Bill Gates made a pretty good fortune in producing microcomputer software, but that's only because some entrepreneurs had a good idea to produce microcomputers. And you remember the story of Apple Computer, and these, Steve Jobs trying to sell this idea of computers to established companies, and they thought, well, this is ridiculous. Nobody's going to want little computers like this, so they started up Apple Computer by themselves, an entrepreneurial insight again. And if they hadn't been entrepreneurial, Gates wouldn't have had his opportunity. But we can take that a step further back. You couldn't have made these personal computers without microprocessors. The microprocessor wasn't very old before companies started making microcomputers. So one entrepreneurial insight, one innovation leads to another. One bit of entrepreneurial activity creates more entrepreneurial opportunities for other people. So where do these entrepreneurial opportunities come from? They come from the activities of other entrepreneurs. One of the big ideas these days in standard growth models is increasing returns. Economists are trying to build in increasing returns through things like knowledge externalities. That's a big idea where people develop knowledge, and then there are knowledge spillovers into other industries, and these knowledge externalities end up creating increasing returns for the economy as a whole. So it's not individual firms or it's not individual firms that have increasing returns, but rather the economy as a whole. And that's a very Smithian kind of idea. Smith argued that the division of labor was limited by the extent of the market. So as we have additional firms, we have economic growth. That leads the market to grow, which leads us to have the opportunity to have increased specialization, which opens up additional entrepreneurial activities. That idea is pretty clear in the, for example, Romer's models of economic growth. But the idea of knowledge externalities is there without really discussing the process by which these knowledge externalities get produced. And so it's worth asking the question, what conditions have to exist in order for these knowledge externalities to be produced? And we've discussed the role of market institutions in creating a fertile environment for knowledge externalities. So if we ask ourselves the question, what's the process that generates these positive externalities that lead to economic growth? I think the Kirznerian theory of entrepreneurship fits in pretty well, and we can point to Kirznerian entrepreneurship as the process that leads to these knowledge externalities that produces economic growth. Essentially, when economic growth is viewed this way, it becomes endogenous because entrepreneurial activity creates economic growth, which generates additional entrepreneurial opportunities, which leads to more economic opportunities, entrepreneurial activities, which creates more economic growth. If you have a very static economy, if you have something like a traditional economy, I think one reason why the Chinese economy was stagnant, didn't exhibit economic growth, is it was organized along more traditional lines and was in fact a relatively static economy. And when things don't change very much from year to year or from generation to generation, obviously there's not going to be very much in the way of economic opportunities or entrepreneurial opportunities. It's the same thing as if we look at the economy in a general equilibrium model. In a general equilibrium model, there aren't any entrepreneurial activities because all of the profit opportunities have already been competed away. So there's really no room for Kirznerian entrepreneurship in a general equilibrium. Now, if the general equilibrium is disturbed for some reason or another, then profit opportunities arise, then entrepreneurial activity can start up. Looked at in this way, you see the engine of economic growth, the engine of innovation in an economy is entrepreneurship. And that's different from the more standard neoclassical models that point to things like investment in human capital and research and development. It's interesting, when you consider, I mean, you might think, well, isn't that really the same thing, though, that entrepreneurship leads to innovation and which creates the incentive to gain additional knowledge and so forth. But if you consider it within the Ricardian framework of production function approach, and you think that the answer really is research and development, technological change, human capital, this isn't something that we just figured out today. In fact, it was well known in centrally planned economies decades ago. And isn't that exactly the strategy that the Soviet Union tried to follow? I mean, they were pretty heavy into research and development. They invested in human capital, they invested in physical capital, and yet they didn't have economic growth. And the reason why, I would assert, is there weren't any entrepreneurial opportunities. See? So what I'm trying to do here is to draw a contrast between the Kirzner'ian view of entrepreneurship and the more Ricardian view of research and development as something that can be produced. You know, you have inputs into a production function where you can produce research and development and end up getting additional economic activity. If we take the Kirzner'ian framework and look at economic growth in the Kirzner'ian framework, research and development isn't the cause of economic growth, it's the effect. The reason why people engage in research and development is because they see that there are profit opportunities. Right? And so they engage in research and development to try to capitalize on those profit opportunities. So research and development is the effect of economic growth, the effect of entrepreneurial activities, rather than the cause of economic growth. And again, to see the contrast, consider an economy like the former Soviet Union, where they invested in research and development. They invested in human and physical capital, and yet they didn't have economic growth. So where does this entrepreneurship come from? It comes from past entrepreneurship, as I've suggested before. We don't have a static setting in the economy in this case. We have a dynamic setting where every entrepreneurial opportunity opens up additional entrepreneurial activities for new entrepreneurs. There are several different factors that might lead to economic growth once we take ourselves out of an equilibrium setting. One is that when an equilibrium is upset, that creates profit opportunities because we're in a disequilibrium situation, which can lead to additional entrepreneurial activity. A second factor that can lead to entrepreneurship and economic growth is increases in income itself. If income is growing, then if we go back to Adam Smith's dictum that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, growing income leads to a bigger market, and as the extent of the market increases, we can end up having a finer division of labor, and we can have increased income as a result. A third factor, and I think this is really the most important factor, is that entrepreneurial insights create new markets and, as a result, provide new opportunities for entrepreneurship that go along with that innovation. And this is really the key to economic growth if we take it from a Kirzner'ian foundation. If we consider, for example, an innovation like, have you all tried an infrared mouse for your computer? You use an you don't have to have the cord, you just use an infrared mouse. And that's an entrepreneurial insight. And again, like the examples I gave before, the only way that you could really have that insight of the infrared mouse is if somebody came up with the idea of using a mouse to begin with the personal computer, and the only way somebody could have that insight is if somebody had developed the personal computer to begin with. Again, these entrepreneurial opportunities aren't just laying around waiting for people to discover them. In fact, pretty rapidly after the opportunities arise, entrepreneurs spot them and they act on them. And if we consider this example of the infrared mouse as an innovation and think about where it came from and consider the three factors that I'd considered before, it wasn't that entrepreneurship occurred because there was a disequilibrium situation. It's not that the market was disequilibrated that created the opportunity for the infrared mouse. It's that the new good, the personal computer, was available. So disequilibrium isn't the explanation. Also, rising incomes, that's not the explanation. Rising incomes, which increases the extent of the market. In fact, it's Kirzner'ian entrepreneurship, the fact that somebody had the idea to begin with that you could work your computer with a mouse, that's a better way to do it. It's this Kirzner'ian insight this innovation that leads to the opportunity for the next innovation. So we end up having entrepreneurial activity that's the result of past entrepreneurial activity. If we consider using Kirzner's model of entrepreneurship as a foundation for economic growth, I think there are a couple of advantages to this. First of all, I think it adds some insight into Kirzner's model of entrepreneurship. And second of all, I think it helps us to understand the process of economic growth a little better. In Kirzner's model of entrepreneurship, he talks about these profit opportunities, these previously unnoticed profit opportunities, but he doesn't really discuss where they come from. And again, I think that's because he's more interested in the equilibrating effects of entrepreneurial activity. And so his idea is, here's a profit opportunity that exists. Let's see how entrepreneurship leads toward market equilibrium. But if we consider Kirznerian entrepreneurship within the context of economic growth, then we endogenize the origin of these profit opportunities. You know, where do these profit opportunities come from to begin with? Well, they come from the past entrepreneurial activities of other individuals. You can see at the same time that we get some insight into where the entrepreneurial activities might arise. We see that, for example, if we have relatively stagnant economies, we have economies that aren't growing and aren't developing, there's not going to be very many entrepreneurial opportunities, so we're not going to have very much Kirznerian entrepreneurship. On the other hand, in growing economies, here's where the increasing returns comes to play. When you have growing economies, more entrepreneurial opportunities are created, which leads to more entrepreneurship, which leads to more economic growth. So instead of just taking these entrepreneurial opportunities as given or just available to entrepreneurs, now by putting this in a growth framework, we can see where the entrepreneurial insights actually come from. They come from past entrepreneurship. At the same time, putting Kirznerian entrepreneurship in as the engine of economic growth helps to give us some insight into growth theory because it shows us how innovation takes place in the economy. It focuses more on the Smithian idea of economic growth. It focuses in on the idea that it's not more or better inputs that lead to economic growth, but rather it's a better environment for entrepreneurs. And this really leads back to the ideas of considering the environment of economic growth. We think about market institutions, stable money, protection of property rights, and so forth. And all of those are environmental factors that lead toward returns to entrepreneurs. And so as a result, if we have a setting that's conducive to entrepreneurship, we're likely to get more economic growth. And again, this contrasts with the neoclassical idea that I think has kept up through the Lucas models and the Romer models and so forth of economic growth, where it's the inputs into the production process. Now, human capital and R&D are fashionable rather than physical capital. But nevertheless, we really don't see the process by which human capital or additional research and development lead to economic growth. And the problem with that is that from a policy standpoint, we run into the same problems that we ran into back when we thought that physical capital was the answer. So that now the advice that we're giving countries, instead of invest in these infant industries and try to get them to grow so that you end up getting inefficient industries and developing economies that continue to drag the economy down because they continually have to subsidize the economy. Now instead we say, well, invest in human capital. That's the answer. You know, if you invest in human capital, but what ends up happening a lot of times, you invest, the economies invest in human capital, but there's no real good way to apply human capital. There's no entrepreneurial opportunities, and a lot of times the human capital that less developed economies invest in goes overseas to economies where there are more entrepreneurial opportunities. So by using Kirzner's entrepreneurship as a foundation for growth theory, we see that it's not the inputs into the production process that are the key, it's the process itself, and it's innovation and entrepreneurship that leads to economic growth. So we need to create an environment that's conducive to economic growth. And then we see that investment in physical capital, research and development activities, investment in human capital, those are the results of economic growth. We don't need to tell people to invest in research and development or human capital. If entrepreneurial opportunities are there and it's profitable to do so, then there's the market incentive for that type of investment to take place. So that's really not good policy advice to begin with. The policy advice is create institutions that are amenable to entrepreneurship and economic growth. And at the same time, you know, if we take the Ricardian models of economic growth, it still leads to bad policy advice as far as advising the investment in human capital, physical capital, research and development, and so forth, focusing on the inputs into the production process rather than the development of the process itself. Since the days of Ricardo, when we focused on the inputs in the production process, first of all, we get pretty pessimistic results. We end up producing the dismal science that shows us how we can never have economic advancement. Yet for 2 centuries, since Adam Smith's insights, we have. And the reason why is, as Smith told us, the important thing is the process itself, the institutional environment that creates an environment that is conducive to economic growth. It's the process, not the inputs into the process. Thanks.